In this video, I'll be talking about a lecture called On Psychotherapy that Freud gave in 1905 in Vienna when he was 49 years old. The participants in the lecture are physicians, the elite, the top figures of the medical world, and the audience is looking at him with skepticism, disdain, and open hostility. In 1905, Freud wasn't the establishment. He was more like an outsider, and he gave this lecture on psychotherapy because he wanted to defend something that to them sounded like witchcraft, mysticism. So his entire goal, his mission, was to convince his audience that talking to a patient is a legitimate medical procedure. In this lecture, Freud is fighting for his professional life, as he's facing a room full of doctors who see his talking cure as something much closer to fortune-telling or mysticism rather than actual science. The need for this lecture was those times were the golden age of what it's called physicochemical medicine. In other words, the bacteria for tuberculosis was being discovered, aspirin was being discovered. The entire medical community deeply believed that every single illness has a physical cause that they could touch or cut or see under a microscope. But then comes Freud saying, well, this paralysis, this sudden blindness will be cured by just talking to a doctor. That sounded like mysticism, faith healing. It sounded completely unscientific. In the beginning of the lecture, Freud started by reminding the audience that about 8 years earlier, he gave a lecture over his previous work with Dr. Joseph Breuer on the studies of hysteria in that exact lecture hall. And he began the lecture saying, "You guys have accepted my diagnosis, but you still despise my treatment." Right at the beginning of the lecture, Freud reminded them that the medical community, at least in German-speaking countries, they had already adopted his terminology for describing the illness. They had actually accepted concepts from his earlier work, such as abreaction and conversion. So the doctors in the room, they agreed that holding emotions was bad. They accepted that if we don't vent, for instance, that we had a bad day, we can kind of explode, and that explosion is conversion in psychoanalysis. In other words, if we have a traumatic memory or some stuck emotion, pressure builds up inside us. Conversion is the idea that a trauma, a mental distress, a painful memory can actually move from the mind to the body and become a physical symptom. A symptom can be an arm that suddenly becomes paralyzed, or you go blind even though your eyes are perfectly healthy. So those doctors in the lecture hall smoking cigars, the ones that only believe in microscopes and bacteria, they accepted that a thought, a trauma, could paralyze a leg. They accepted because they had seen it. They had dealt with hysterical patients. They had seen young women who were physically healthy but couldn't walk. They had examined them. They had run all the tests they had available at the time, and they couldn't find a problem. They couldn't find a bacteria. They couldn't find any physical cause. So they had to accept the psychological explanation almost by default. So they were okay with the theory that the mind could break the body, but they just were not okay with the idea that the mind could also fix the body. And Freud says that those doctors in his lecture understood the cause of the disease, but the cure for it, which was talking, for them it was unscientific and nonsense because they wanted a pill, an injection to fix the paralysis. They did not want to sit and listen to the patient for hours on end. So Freud had to somehow prove that words, speech, and talking are legitimate medical tools. Freud argues that psychotherapy isn't new. He says it's actually the oldest form of medicine. And in the lecture, Freud doesn't start saying, I've discovered a brand new technology. He does the exact opposite. He looks at his audience and says, actually, we are practicing the oldest form of medicine in human history. He's basically saying, you all call psychotherapy mysticism. Actually, it's the bedrock of our entire profession. In the lecture, Freud also talks about hypnosis that was discovered by Joseph Breuer, which Freud eventually abandoned because Freud had noticed in his practice that with hypnosis, the cure was often temporary and the symptom could come back because the root cause hadn't been touched at all with hypnosis. In the lecture, Freud also introduces a concept called resistance. Resistance is the keystone of his entire theory. It's the central discovery. Freud noticed that when he tried to ask patients about their trauma or their difficult memories, they just didn't passively let everything out. They fought back. The patient would change the subject. They would get angry at him or suddenly forget their appointments. While other doctors might have just seen the patient as difficult or uncooperative, Freud saw it as data. He realized that the force that was preventing the patient from speaking is the same force that caused the illness in the first place. And in this moment of the lecture, Freud seems annoyed that his colleagues think that the talking cure is easy. He complains that people think that anyone can do it. He says you wouldn't give a scalpel to a medical student who doesn't know anatomy. He's making a powerful argument for the technical difficulty of the work. He's saying this isn't just chatting, it's a delicate, difficult surgical procedure on the mind. With this argument, Freud establishes psychoanalysis as a discipline. It requires study, it requires technique and skill. In this lecture, he lays out what he calls the contraindications. He refuses to treat patients who do not possess a reasonable degree of education and a fairly reliable character. He talks about people who are good for nothing even when they are healthy. This criteria of patient selection may sound exclusive and elitist, but he needed an active partner in the process. The patient needs to want to be treated too. For Freud, psychoanalysis isn't something that's done to you, like surgery. It's something that's done with you. It's a collaboration. So if the patient lacks the intellectual capacity to grasp the concepts, or if they don't want to face their own lies and contradictions, the process just fails. Freud is basically saying, I can't save you from yourself if you refuse to do the work with me. He also specifically calls out forced patients. Who are those people dragged into therapy by their relatives? Freud essentially says, if you don't want to be here, if your own suffering isn't your motivation, then psychotherapy won't help you. And this is still very true today. We cannot force someone to undertake therapy if they don't want it. The contraindication is also for those with severe mental states. He lists psychosis, states of confusion, and deep-rooted depression. Freud says we need what he calls a foothold of normality to begin the work. If a patient is actively hallucinating or completely detached from reality, we can't analyze their resistance if there is no stable ego left to talk to. With this, Freud is very clear. His method requires a functioning, rational mind to work with. And the other contraindication is the age limit. Freud in this lecture claims that people near or above the age of 50 are not suitable for psychoanalysis. He gives two reasons for that. He claims that people over 50 lack elasticity of their mental processes. In simple words, we can't teach old dogs new tricks. The second reason is purely logistical. He says that the mass of historical material would be too great as there is too much emotional baggage. He thought that if we have to dig through 50 years of memories, traumas, and repressions, the analysis would never end. I'm going to pause here to explain the reason why Freud believed that after 50, analysis wouldn't help. In 1905, the concept of neuroplasticity didn't exist. The prevailing scientific belief was that the brain developed until we hit adulthood, and then it slowly calcified. In other words, it got harder, fixed, and unchanged. The idea that a 50-year-old brain could fundamentally change its personality structure was considered biologically impossible. So Freud wasn't being ageist. He was working with the scientific knowledge available at the time. Today, psychology has completely rejected this idea. We now know that the brain can change throughout life, but for Freud, analysis belonged to the young, because according to the science of his time, real change later on in life simply could not happen. Another contraindication that Freud lists in this lecture was that psychoanalysis is not recommended for those with what was then called hysterical anorexia. Now, there is one more controversial topic in this lecture, which was the sex question that made Freud so infamous, and probably the reason that half the people in the lecture hall didn't like him before he even opened his mouth. Freud was labeled by critics as the sex-focused doctor, as they thought that the cure of his treatment was to go out and have more sex. The gossip was that Freud's big insight was just that everyone needs to have more sex because, according to the gossip, neurosis comes from sexual deprivation. This is essential to understanding Freud because people still get this wrong today, even over 100 years later. The public and many doctors thought his theory was simply this: you are sick because you're not having enough sex. You have sexual privation, therefore the cure is to go out and have more sex. Freud rejected this completely by saying that sexual need and privation are merely one factor at work in the mechanism of neurosis. He says, recommending more sex, it's rarely a good advice because the internal conflict is still there. The mental block, the problem that prevented them from enjoying life, is still going to be there. It doesn't remove the resistance. And Freud finishes the lecture by saying, let me finish this with a defensive note. I hope that if you set aside your hostility and your prejudices, your interest in psychotherapy will support our effort to succeed in treating even very serious psychological illnesses. I recommend reading this paper because I didn't address everything that was spoken in the lecture. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video.